The morning they put my grandfather's tools on the sidewalk, it was raining. Not hard rain. The quiet kind that soaks through everything and leaves no mark you can point to. I stood at the end of the driveway in a coat that had belonged to him, and I watched my Uncle Terence carry a dented red toolbox past me without once looking at my face, and I understood then that the decision had been made long before they bothered to tell me. I was 21 years old. I had been living in my grandfather's house on Finch Landing Road in Grays Harbor County, Washington since I was 14, when my mother left for the last time and my grandfather, Clement Beaulieu, had driven 4 hours north to get me from a school parking lot and said, without asking any questions, "Put your bag in the back." I had lived under his roof for 7 years, worked alongside him, learned from him, and when he died of a stroke in early February, before I had figured out what any of my life was going to look like, his 4 children descended on that house within 10 days and sorted his belongings the way people sort things when they believe there is money in the room. There was not much money. What there was, they divided. They gave me the truck because it was old and they did not want it, and a cardboard box of things they said were mine, photographs mostly, and a winter jacket. They told me I had until the end of the month because they were selling the house to settle the estate. They gave me nothing else, or so they believed. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What they did not give me, because they did not know it existed, was the letter my grandfather had left inside a coffee tin on the second shelf of his fishing shed, addressed in his handwriting to me, sealed with a strip of masking tape, with a small brass key taped to the outside. The key was old, longer than a house key, with a round bow and a shaft worn smooth from handling. I had been in that shed 100 times. I had never noticed the tin. I found the letter 3 days after they cleared the house, when I went back to get the last of my things and stood in the shed for a while, because it was the only room that still smelled like him, marine grease and cedar, and the particular salt damp of the coast. I took the tin down because it was out of place on that shelf, among the lures and the rope coils. I opened it because my name was on the outside. I sat on an overturned crab trap in that shed, and I read what my grandfather had written. He had not written much. Clement Beaulieu was not a man who used more words than necessary. The letter was a single page, front and back, written in a slanted, careful hand on the back of a boat insurance form. He wrote that he had something to tell me that he had never said out loud, because saying it out loud in the years before would have put it at risk. He wrote that he owned a property that none of his children knew about, that he had owned it his entire adult life, and had paid the taxes on it quietly, separately, through a post office box in Aberdeen that no one in the family knew existed. That he had chosen to do this because the property had been his father's and his father's before that, and he had watched what happened when property went through estates without protection. He had watched his own mother's family lose a farm in Louisiana that way in 1962, and he had decided in his 30s that he would not let the same thing happen again. The property was a cannery, a small salmon and crab cannery on the Tidal inlet at the southern end of Grays Harbor, built in 1919 by my great-great-grandfather Emilio Beaulieu, who had come west from Louisiana and bought the land for $40 and a pig, and had built the cannery with his own hands and the hands of 2 cousins and a Finnish neighbor who taught him to work in the rain. Emilio had run it until the early 1940s. My great-grandfather had run it briefly after the war. Then it sat. My grandfather wrote that the cannery building itself was structurally sound, because Emilio had built on poured concrete pilings driven into the tidal flat, and that the walls were old-growth cedar that had outlasted everything else built in that county in the same decade. He wrote that the building had flooded once in 1949, and that after the flood, his father had sealed the cold room, the processing cold storage in the rear of the cannery, and had not opened it since. He wrote that the cold room was the reason I needed to go. He wrote that there were things inside that cold room that his father had put there for safekeeping before he died, and that he himself had never opened it, because he had not had the right to, because the room and what was in it belonged to whoever came next and had the sense to go looking. He wrote that the key on the outside of the tin fit the padlock on the cold room door. He wrote the address of the property and gave directions to the access road off Harborview Lane, because it was not on any map he knew of. He wrote that the county deed was recorded at the Grays Harbor County Recorder's Office under the name Beaulieu Tidal Holdings, which was a name he had registered as a sole proprietorship in 1978 to hold the property separate from his personal estate. He wrote, at the very end, in a line that stood separate from the rest, "Callie, you stayed. That matters more than you know. This is not what I am leaving you instead of something else. This is what I saved for the one who would know what to do with it." I read that last line 4 times in the shed. Then I put the letter back in the tin and the tin in my jacket pocket, and I drove to Aberdeen. The Grays Harbor County Recorder's Office is on East Market Street, a low brick building with fluorescent lighting and a woman at the front desk who looked at me the way people look at a 21-year-old who walks in alone asking about a property deed. I gave her the name, Beaulieu Tidal Holdings. She typed it. She waited. She typed it again. Then she turned the monitor slightly so I could see it. The property at the south inlet of Grays Harbor, listed at the address my grandfather had given me. 4 acres of tidal flat and upland. The cannery structure, built 1919, recorded separately as an improvement to the land in a 1921 filing. The deed was in the name of Beaulieu Tidal Holdings, a sole proprietorship. The registered agent of that proprietorship, updated in 1978 and again in 2009, was Clement Beaulieu. The most recent update on file, dated 6 months before my grandfather died, changed the registered agent to Callista Marguerite Beaulieu. My grandfather had changed the registration to my name while he was still alive, while he could still drive himself to the county seat and sign a document and hand it to a clerk. He had made the change without telling me, because telling me would have meant explaining what he owned and why, and explaining that would have risked the explanation getting back to his children before he was ready. The deed transfer itself, when the woman at the desk pulled it, had been filed 3 years before his death. He had not waited until he was dying. He had filed it when he was still well, when his handwriting was still steady, when the decision was entirely and calmly his. The property had been mine for 3 years, and I had not known. I drove out to Harborview Lane that afternoon. The access road was exactly where my grandfather's letter said it would be, behind a rusted gate with a chain and a combination lock whose combination he had also written in the letter. The year my great-great-grandfather Emilio had arrived in Washington. 1909. The road was packed gravel and oyster shell, maybe a quarter-mile long, running downhill through shore pine and Himalayan blackberry that had grown up over the years and grabbed at both sides of the truck. At the bottom, the land opened into a flat of estuary grass and bare tidal mud, and there was the cannery. It was bigger than I had expected. 2 stories of old-growth cedar, siding gone silver gray with decades of salt air, sitting on its concrete pilings above the high tide line with a long loading dock extending out over the flat toward the inlet channel. The roof was corrugated metal, green with moss. The large bay doors on the inlet side were closed and padlocked. On the upland side, a regular door stood slightly ajar, the wood warped by years of wet air until it could no longer fully close. I sat in the truck for a few minutes looking at it. The inlet was quiet. A great blue heron stood on a piling 30 feet out, motionless, watching something in the water below. The tide was going out and the mudflat smell rose up, the rich dark smell of marine sediment and salt grass, and something older underneath that I could not name. I got out of the truck. The side door opened when I pushed it, the warped wood dragging against the concrete threshold. The interior was dark until my eyes adjusted to the light coming through gaps in the siding and the salt-crusted skylights above. The cannery floor was original concrete, cracked in long seams but intact, stained dark where water had stood in the 1949 flood and never quite bleached back out. Old machinery stood in the shadows, the long steel tables where the fish would have been processed, a row of rusted can-seaming machines along the north wall, overhead rail systems for moving heavy loads, all of it still in place, still standing, covered in the fine gray dust that settles on things left alone for decades. Everything smelled of old iron and sea salt and the ghost of a fish that was no longer there. I walked the floor slowly. I touched the tables. I ran my hand along the seaming machines, and the rust came off on my palm in fine red powder. The machinery was old, but it was not ruined. It was the kind of equipment that does not rot because it is made entirely of metal, and the men who built it believe in building things to last. At the back of the cannery, past the processing floor and a row of wooden shelving that had once held supplies, there was a door. It was not a regular door. It was a cold room door, the kind built to hold temperature. 8 inches of insulated construction faced with steel plate on the outside and wood on the inside, mounted in a frame that had been set separately from the cannery's original framing. Someone had built this room inside the larger building after the fact as a contained space. The door hung plumb and true. The hinges were the size of my hand. The padlock on the hasp was a large, heavy thing that had gone the color of old pennies. I put my grandfather's key in it. The key turned on the first try. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The padlock released with a clunk that I felt in my wrist. I pulled it free of the hasp. I set it on the floor at my feet. The door itself was heavier than I expected, and I had to use both hands and my shoulder to break the seal that years of compression had set. It gave with a low sighing sound, the sound of air that had been held still for a long time, finally moving. The cold room was dark. I used my phone's flashlight. The room was roughly 12 feet square with 8-foot ceilings and walls lined in the same old-growth cedar as the exterior of the building. Tongue-and-groove planks fitted close enough that no light had ever passed between them. The floor was poured concrete like the rest of the cannery. In the center of the room, someone had built a simple platform of 2x4s, raised about 6 inches off the floor, and on the platform was a wooden crate, the kind used for shipping, with my great-grandfather's name stenciled on the side in black paint. Beaulieu, and below it, stenciled in smaller letters, a year. 1948. Beside the crate on the floor was a stack of ledger books tied together with twine that had dried and gone brittle. And beside the ledgers, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with the same kind of twine, was a flat package about the size of a large picture frame. I stood in the doorway with the flashlight on the crate, and I breathed slowly, and I thought about the fact that this room had been sealed for 76 years, that whatever was inside, it had been placed here by a man who died before my grandfather was grown, and that my grandfather had kept this door closed his whole life because his father had asked him to, and his father had asked him to because whatever was inside was meant to wait for someone who needed it. I went in. The crate opened without a struggle once I found the pry point at the corner. The lid had been nailed down, but the nails had gone to rust, and they gave way more easily than nails should, which told me something about how long the room had held its conditions. Inside the crate, packed in shredded newspaper from 1948, was a second wooden box, smaller, fitted with brass hinges and a small brass catch. Not locked. Inside the smaller box was a folded document wrapped in a separate piece of oilcloth. I unfolded it on the platform, holding my phone above it. The document was a deed. Original, not a copy, with a raised stamp of the Grays Harbor County Recorder's Office in the lower left corner and a filing date of March 14th, 1922. It transferred the cannery property and all structures thereon from Emilio Beaulieu to the Beaulieu Family Trust, established under the laws of the state of Washington, in trust for the use and benefit of the descendants of Emilio Beaulieu in perpetuity, with specific language about the title rights associated with the property. Title rights: the right to harvest shellfish and other marine life from the tidal flat associated with the property, extending to the channel line of the inlet. I read that section 3 times. Title rights in Washington state, I would learn over the coming weeks, are not automatically included with upland property. They are separate, and they're specific, and they're governed by a distinct body of law that goes back to the territorial period. A property owner with title rights to a productive inlet has something worth considerably more than the upland alone. Emilio Beaulieu, who had come from Louisiana in 1909 and bought 40 acres and a tidal flat for $40 and a pig, had somehow known enough in 1922 to have those title rights formally recorded as part of the family trust conveyance. Under the deed was a second document, smaller, on thinner paper, also dated 1948, written in my great-grandfather's hand. Not a legal document, a letter. He wrote in formal English with occasional French phrases worked in the way old Louisiana families did, not for effect, but because some things were easier to say in the older language. He wrote that he was putting these documents in the cold room because the cold room was the safest place he could think of, because it had been built to hold things that needed to be preserved, and because he had a feeling, the way old men get feelings, that what was coming in the next years was not going to be kind to people like him, and he wanted what was his to still be his on the other side of it. He wrote that the Tidal flat had been leased informally to a neighboring cannery for the past several years, and that the lease arrangement had never been put in writing. He wrote that this was a mistake he wanted corrected. He wrote that the man who had been harvesting that flat owed him money he had never paid, and that rather than fight about it, he had simply stopped the arrangement and sealed the deed and the title rights documentation in this room so that no one could claim they did not know about them. He wrote that whoever opened this room should take the deed to a lawyer first and a buyer second, and should not let anyone tell them that title rights in a producing inlet were not worth the paper they were recorded on. He wrote, at the end, in French, "Ce qu'a été fait avec soin dur." What was done with care endures. I sat in that cold room for a long time. Then I took the deed, the letter, the ledgers, and the wrapped flat package, and I carried them out to the truck. The flat package I set on the passenger seat and unwrapped it there in the truck cab in the gray Washington light. It was a framed photograph. My great-great-grandfather Emilio, young, standing in front of the cannery in what must have been the early 1920s, in the same spot I had parked the truck. The cannery behind him was new then, the cedar siding still pale, the loading dock freshly built. He was looking directly at the camera with an expression I had seen on my grandfather's face 100 times. The expression of a man who has done something he believes in and is not asking anyone's permission to feel good about it. I drove to Aberdeen and I found a lawyer. Her name was Sandra Perlt, and she ran a small general practice out of an office above a bakery on Wishka Street. She had a Grays Harbor County history book on a shelf behind her desk and a potted fern that looked like it had survived some things. I walked in without an appointment and asked if she had time. She looked at me, 21 years old, holding a folder of old documents, and she said she had an hour. I put everything on her desk. She read for 45 minutes without saying much. She asked me twice to clarify things from my grandfather's letter. She made 3 phone calls, 2 to the county recorder's office, and 1 to someone she called Marsh, whose full name I never learned, who she described as knowing more about Washington title law than anyone still working in this county. When she got off the phone with Marsh, she set the receiver down slowly and looked at me. "The deed is clean," she said, "filed properly in 1922 in a trust formation that was legal under the laws of the time and has continued to be recognized. Your grandfather's registration of the property management under Beaulieu Title Holdings and the subsequent transfer of agency to your name is legally sound. You are the current authorized agent of this trust, which means for all practical purposes, the property is yours to manage and yours to act on behalf of." "And the title rights?" I said. She looked at her notes. "The title rights recorded in this deed cover the flat from the upland boundary to the channel line of the South Inlet. That's roughly 6 acres of tidal ground." She paused. "Callie, do you know what the South Inlet of Grays Harbor produces?" I told her I knew some fishing. "Salmon, crab, oysters," she said. "The South Inlet Flats have been one of the most productive natural oyster beds in Grays Harbor County for the past 30 years. There are 2 commercial oyster operations that lease tidal ground from the state in that area. The ground your family owns sits adjacent to both of them." She set down her pen. "The title rights recorded here have never been leased, never been transferred, and never been disputed because nobody outside your family knew they existed." I looked at the framed photograph on her desk, where I had set it when I came in. Emilio Beaulieu in front of his. New cannery, not asking anyone's permission. "What do I do first?" I said. Sandra Perlt was practical and clear. She said I needed to do several things in order. First, obtain certified copies of all recorded documents from the county recorder's office. Second, have the title flat surveyed to confirm the exact boundaries of the title rights. Third, consult with a marine resources attorney who specialized in Washington shellfish law before speaking to anyone about leasing. Fourth, make no decisions about the cannery structure until I understood what I was working with. She said she could draft a letter of representation confirming my authority as agent of the Beaulieu Tidal Holdings Trust, which would be important if anyone challenged my right to access or act on behalf of the property. Anyone, I said. Anyone, she confirmed. I went to the county recorder's office the next morning and paid for certified copies of every document. The woman at the desk remembered me from the day before. She handed me the copies without comment. But as I turned to leave, she said, "Your great-great-grandfather filed clean." Not everyone did back then. I thanked her and walked out into the gray morning. The survey took 2 weeks. A man named Donald Kreischer, who had been doing tidal surveys in Grays Harbor for 30 years, walked the flat with equipment I could not name on a cold morning in early March while I stood at the edge of the upland and watched. He came back up the bank an hour later and pulled off his waders and told me in plain language what he had found. 6.2 acres of tidal flat, he said, with boundaries that matched the 1922 deed description to within acceptable survey tolerance. The flat ran from the cannery pilings out to the channel, the natural oyster culture zone, undisturbed and unfarmed, with substrate conditions he described as excellent. He said he had surveyed both neighboring tidal leases and that the Beaulieu flats sat between them like a finger. He said whoever owned that flat had something that the two operations on either side had been working around for 30 years. I thanked him and drove back to the cannery and sat on the loading dock until the tide came in, watching the water rise over the flat my great-great-grandfather had bought in 1909 and recorded in trust in 1922 and sealed in a cold room in 1948 so that the wrong people could not take it before the right person came to claim it. The letter from my Uncle Terence came in April. I had expected it. He had heard, through the loose information network of a family that had dispersed across the county, that I had been spending time at property out on Harborview Lane. He did not know what the property was. He did not know about the deed, or the title rights, or the 1922 trust. He knew only that I had been seen in the truck on that access road, and that some inquiry at the county recorder's office had turned up a registration involving the Beaulieu name. He wrote that he was concerned I was wasting my time on something that wasn't mine, that my grandfather's estate had been fully settled, and that if I had found any property associated with the family, I should speak with the estate attorney rather than acting unilaterally. I read the letter once and called Sandra Perlt. She told me to direct all further communication through her office. She sent Terence a letter that same week, formal and precise, explaining that the property at the South Inlet was held in a family trust predating my grandfather's death by decades, that the trust was legally distinct from the settled estate, and that my authority as agent of the trust was documented and recorded. Terence did not write again for 3 weeks. When he did, it was a different kind of letter. Shorter. The anger underneath, it was easier to read because he had stopped trying to sound reasonable. He wrote that the family had not been informed of any such trust. He wrote that it seemed strange that my grandfather had never mentioned it. He wrote that he intended to have the matter reviewed by an attorney. I had been expecting that, too. What I had not been expecting was the morning 2 weeks later when a man I did not know parked a black SUV at the end of the access road and walked down to the cannery while I was on the loading dock reading through the ledgers my great-grandfather had left. He was in his 40s, in a coat that was slightly too clean for that road, and he introduced himself as a property assessor working on behalf of a client interested in the South Inlet area. Whose client? I said. He said he was not at liberty to say, but that his client had significant experience in aquaculture development in Grays Harbor County and was interested in tidal ground in this area. I set down the ledger. The flat is not for sale, I said. He did a version of a smile that men in clean coats do when they expect resistance to be temporary. He said that, in his experience, property in this condition, meaning the cannery building, which had obvious structural concerns, came with costs that could be difficult for a single owner to manage, and that a motivated buyer could make the process considerably easier. I looked at the cannery behind me, the silver-gray cedar, the concrete pilings that Emilio Beaulieu had poured in 1919 and which had not moved in 105 years. The loading dock that extended out over the flat where the oyster substrate lay undisturbed. The flat is not for sale, I said again, and neither is the cannery. He left his car on the dock rail and drove back up the access road. I took the card and called Sandra Pearl from the dock. She was not surprised. She said this kind of approach came when someone had learned enough about a property to know it was valuable, but not enough to know whether the ownership was solid. The goal was to create doubt before the owner understood what they had. She said the formal letter she had already sent should have made the ownership position clear, and that if the man on the dock was representing my uncle or his attorney, she would be sending a follow-up that made things considerably clearer. Make it formal, I said. Already drafting it, she said. I turned back to the ledger. My great-grandfather had kept detailed records. The ledger from the years the cannery was operating, 1919 through 1941, documented every season, every species, every pound of salmon and crab, and the smaller quantities of oyster and clam that came off the flat. He had kept records of every payment, every lease arrangement, every cost of operation. And in the back of the last ledger, in a section he had headed Simply Notes, he had written a careful accounting of the informal arrangements with a neighboring property in the years just before he sealed the cold room. The neighboring operation had been harvesting the Beaulieu Tidal flat without a formal lease. He had noted the years this occurred and his estimate of what the harvest had been worth based on the going rate at the Aberdeen fish docks. The figure he had written was not precise, but it was specific enough to be meaningful. I took the ledgers to Sandra Pearl the following week. She read the notes section twice. She made a phone call to Marsh, the title law specialist, while I sat in the chair across from her desk. When she got off the phone, she had an expression I had not seen from her before. Not surprised. Something more like satisfied. The neighboring operation you mentioned, she said. The one that had been harvesting the Beaulieu flat informally. Do you know if that operation is still in business? I do not know. I had not researched it. She did. The operation had changed hands twice since my great-grandfather's time, but it still existed, under a different name, currently held by a family-owned shellfish company with 2 tidal leases in the South Inlet. One of those leases bordered the Beaulieu flat on the north side. She said the ledger documentation of the informal harvest arrangement, combined with the recorded title rights, created a legal question about historical use of the flat that was worth exploring before I made any decisions about leasing or selling. She said the word exploring carefully, the way lawyers use words when they mean something more than the word says on its surface. I'm not looking to fight anyone, I said. No, she said, but you should know what you have before you decide what to do with it. I thought about my grandfather's letter, about what he had written at the end, that I had stayed, that it mattered, that this was not a consolation, but something saved. What will my great-grandfather have done? I said. Sandra Pearl looked at the ledger on her desk. Based on these notes, she said, he would have made them put it in writing. The Marine Resources attorney Sandra referred me to was a woman named Opal Denham, who practiced out of Olympia and came to Grays Harbor twice a month. She was 63, small, with close-cropped white hair and a way of reading documents that reminded me of the way Donald Kreischer had walked my title flat. Methodical, specific, certain of what she was looking for. Opal read everything over the course of 2 days. She made her own calls to the county recorder's office. She reviewed the survey. She reviewed the ledger. She drove out to the cannery alone on a Thursday morning and walked the flat herself at low tide. When she came back with her findings, she sat across from me in Sandra's office and told me, in the careful language she had clearly used before with people who were not using good news, what the title rights were worth. The South Inlet flat, 6.2 acres, with documented substrate quality and proximity to 2 established commercial oyster operations, had a lease value she put in a range. The low end of that range was a number that stopped me from speaking for a moment. The high end was higher. This was not, she said, a lease value based on speculation. This was based on current lease rates for comparable ground in Grays Harbor County, which she had researched before coming. She said the neighboring shellfish company, when approached through proper channels by an attorney representing the Beaulieu Trust, would almost certainly prefer a formal lease arrangement to the alternative of a protracted legal question about historical harvest rights. She said she could make that approach if I wanted. I thought about Emilio Beaulieu in the photograph, standing in front of the cannery he had built, not asking permission. I thought about the cold room he had sealed in 1948 with the documents inside and the key on the outside, because he wanted whoever came next to find things in order. I thought about my grandfather driving 4 hours north to get me from a school parking lot and saying, without asking any questions, "Put your bag in the back." "Make the approach," I said. The shellfish company's response came within 2 weeks. Faster than Opal had expected, which she said told her something about how long they had been aware of the Beaulieu title rights question without addressing it. They proposed a lease. 40 years, renewable, at a figure that landed near the top of Opal's projected range, with a one-time payment for the historical use period documented in my great-grandfather's ledger. That payment was separate from the lease. It was not a lawsuit. It was an acknowledgement, made quietly and without admission of liability, of what the ledger said had happened. I signed the lease in Sandra Pearl's office on a Thursday morning in May, 3 months after I had sat in a fishing shed in the rain and read a letter from my grandfather. The one-time payment cleared the following week. The first lease payment came the month after. I am not going to say the number out loud, because numbers said out loud lose something. What I will say is that it was enough to stop the feeling I had been living with since February, the feeling of standing on ground that belonged to someone else. It was enough to get the truck properly repaired and to pay the back property taxes on the cannery that had accumulated in the last years of my grandfather's life, when other things had taken his attention. It was enough to keep me, modestly and carefully, while I figured out what came next. What came next was the cannery. I had not planned to do anything with the building quickly. Sandra and Opal both told me to take my time, that the lease income gave me the stability to think rather than react, and that whatever I did with the cannery should come from a plan, not a deadline. But I kept going back. I would drive out on mornings when the tide was low and walk the flat, and then sit on the loading dock and look at the building and think about what it had been and what it could be. A man in Hoquiam who restored old industrial structures told me the cannery bones were sounder than most buildings half its age. A contractor from Aberdeen came out and looked at the roof and the pilings and said the concrete was extraordinary, that they had used a mix he had seen in other buildings from that era along the coast, a formula that included a proportion of oyster shell aggregate that had given the concrete a flexibility ordinary mix did not have. He said Emilio had built it to last. I believed him. I found a photograph in the ledgers loose, tucked between 2 pages in the second volume of the cannery in operation, 1931. Workers on the floor around the processing tables, fish coming off the loading dock on the overhead rail system, the bay doors open to the inlet, the flat visible beyond. The workers were men and women both, and they were looking at the camera with the particular unself-consciousness of people who are photographed while working and have not had time to compose themselves. I put that photograph in the cold room, next to my great-great-grandfather's letter in a frame I bought at a second-hand store in Aberdeen. When my Uncle Terence called in June, for months after the cold room opened, I let Sandra answer for me. She had been fielding his attorney's questions about the trust structure for weeks. The questions had become less aggressive over time, as the legal position became clearer and the lease arrangement became a matter of public record. Terence did not ask for anything. He asked, through his attorney, whether I would be willing to have a conversation. I was. We met at a coffee shop in Hoquiam in July, my uncle and I. He was 62. He had my grandfather's eyes and not much else of my grandfather in him. He sat across from me with his hands around a coffee cup, and he said, after a few minutes of saying nothing, that he had not known about the cannery. I know, I said. He never told us, he said. He didn't tell me either, I said. Not until after. Terence was quiet for a moment. He knew what would happen if he'd told us, he said. He was not quite accusing anyone. He was not quite accepting something either. He was somewhere in the middle, in the specific difficult place a person occupies when they understand they have behaved in a way that cannot be undone and are trying to decide what to do with that understanding. He knew what would happen. I agreed. We did not resolve anything that afternoon. I did not have anything to offer him, and I was not looking for his approval. But I told him that I intended to restore the cannery, over time, carefully, and that I intended to do it in a way that kept the Beaulieu name on the building. He nodded at that. He did not ask to be part of it. I did not invite him to be. But when he stood up to leave, he paused and said He always said you were the one who understood things. He did not say it like a compliment exactly. He said it like a fact he had finally decided to stop arguing with. By fall, I had a plan for the cannery. Not a big plan. The plan of a 21-year-old who has more patience than resources and more intention than timeline. I wanted to restore the processing floor, stabilize the structure, and open the building to the public in some form, not as a museum and not as a restaurant and not as anything that required more money than I had. As a place that could be rented for events, for workshops, for the kind of gathering that a waterfront building with a 100-year history and a working tidal flat outside is suited for. I hired a preservation carpenter named Hensley Okafor who had worked on 3 other historic structures in the county and who walked through the cannery on his first visit with the same expression the contractor had had, the expression of someone who has been expecting to find problems and has found something unexpected instead. This is not a rescue project, Hensley told me. This is a restoration. There's a difference. He paused at the processing tables and ran his hand along the steel surface. These are usable, he said, with cleaning and some mechanical attention. These are usable right now. We started work in October. The processing tables were cleaned and oiled. The overhead rail system, which was intact, was inspected by a mechanical engineer Hensley knew and declared functional. The bay doors were rehung. The skylights were reglazed. The roof, which needed the most work, was resurfaced section by section over 6 weeks, with Hensley's crew working in the coast weather the way coast workers do, in rain gear and without complaint. The loading dock was rebuilt in the same timber dimensions as the original, using Douglas fir from a mill in Shelton that Hensley said was the closest thing available to the original old growth. In December, I opened the cold room again and took out the framed photograph of Emilio and hung it on the interior wall of the cannery, above the processing tables, where the workers in the 1931 photograph had worked. I put a small placard beside it. His name, his birth year, the year he arrived from Louisiana, the year he built this building. What was done with care endures. On a Saturday morning in late January, a year and a few weeks after my grandfather's stroke, I opened the cannery for the first time to people who were not me or a contractor. A handful of people from the County Historical Society came to see the restoration. A photographer from the Aberdeen Daily World came and took photographs. A woman who had worked as a marine biologist at the estuary reserve south of the inlet came to look at the tidal flat documentation and stayed for 2 hours looking at the ledgers. She told me, before she left, that the 6.2 acres of tidal flat held conditions she had not seen in a natural oyster habitat in this county in 15 years. She asked if I would be open, eventually, to allowing the university's marine science department to use the flat for research in addition to the lease arrangement. I said I would think about it. I thought about it for 3 days, and then I said yes. What I have now, at 22 years old, is not a fortune. A woman at the county recorder's office used that word once in conversation, and I understood what she meant, but the word did not feel right. A fortune implies something that arrived. What I have arrived at is different from that. I have a building that has been standing since 1919 and will continue to stand because the man who built it understood what materials last and what materials do not. I have a tidal flat that has been producing since longer than anyone alive can say, and which will keep producing under the terms of a lease that puts what was always in the Beaulieu family's possession into writing for the first time. I have a cold room that has been open to the air since February, in which I swept and painted and use now as a small storage room for tools and records, with my great-great-grandfather's letter in a frame on the wall inside it, because it seemed like the right place for it. And I have what my grandfather left me in that coffee tin on the second shelf of his fishing shed, which is not the property exactly, though that is part of it. What I have is the understanding that the people who took care of things, who kept records and sealed rooms and paid taxes through post office boxes and drove 4 hours north without asking questions, those people were building something. Not for themselves, for whoever came next and had the sense to go looking. I went looking. I found everything they left. On a morning last spring, I sat on the cannery loading dock at low tide with the coffee I had made on the camp stove I still keep in the back corner of the building, and I watched a great blue heron stand on a piling 30 feet out over the flat the way the heron had stood on my first day here. The oyster substrate was visible at low water, the gray-brown of it stretching out toward the channel, undisturbed and unharvested for all the years it had been waiting. The tide would come back. It always did. Emilio had known that. My great-grandfather had known it. My grandfather had known it and had kept this place and its papers safe through decades of quiet, deliberate care, so that when the time came, when the person came, there would be something left to find. There is. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.